So this Masters of Tradition Cultural Journey Map is, I'm going to put it in the chat box, one of my favorites on what you're talking about. And we can also look at demographic characteristics in the same platform that we were looking at earlier. But we, Esri and Smithsonian, worked on this one. So as you can see, you've got an interactive map here at your fingertips, but you also have these musicians. Hey, Leslie was just talking about musicians, and you've got different folks in different parts of the country where you've got, hey, you know, what's happening here in Anadarko. So here's the Kiowa regalia maker. And I was just down in Oklahoma last week, so I know about this one. But there's other wonderful stories and points here. Here's this person over in Ellsworth. I love this, that Czech eggs. I mean, it's just all this stuff is just fascinating. Why in the world did Czech people migrate to Kansas, you know, in 1880?
Mm-hmm.
What attracted them to live in Kansas? But this is a nice one to show, you know, kind of an interactive what's where, why is it there, and why should we care, and the cultural heritage map. I love this. This is one of my favorites. But yes, we could look at also along the lines of what you're saying. Let's look at block group, census tract, zip code, county level demographic data, look at median age, ethnicity, median income, all kinds of different variables at that scale over time. So 2010 census, 2020 census, and then also the American Community Survey that takes place between the decennial census years, so we can get some detail for 2021, 2022, et cetera. So we can do that as well. I like to start here though, and I hope you find this a good one. Yeah, I put it in the chat box.
I do.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, folks. Now let's talk about map-related books here. I've got several that I wanted to share, but I'd like you to think about some of yours. Cool. Yeah, thanks, folks. Now let's talk about map-related books here. I've got several that I wanted to share, but I'd like you to think about some of yours. The tale I was telling you earlier about the French surveying team that went down into Ecuador and then also went up to Svalbard, north of Norway, and their challenges that they faced is actually in a book called The Mapmaker's Wife. The reason why it's called that is because one of the French surveyors in Ecuador married a Ecuadorian native, and then the surveyor went over the mountains to basically British Guyana on the east coast of South America. And after about 6 months, his spouse decided to join him. So the second half of the book is not about the surveying team, but it's about her journey over the Amazon, over the Andes into the Amazon. And it's a fascinating tale of survival because it was the first documented story of anyone ever crossing and living to telling the tale of going over the Andes. And of course, they didn't have, you know, weatherproof, you know, clothing and in water bottles and stuff like we have nowadays, right? This was 1735 era, so almost 300 years ago. Fascinating. That's a great one. Longitude is probably the most well-known in the geographic mapping space because it did have pretty wide appeal outside of, you know, you and I being interested in this. It's all about the first longitude clock. You know, latitude was always pretty easy to determine because of sextants and astrolabes and other instruments that helped us to figure out how far north the North Star was, especially in the northern hemisphere, and therefore what our latitude was based on the stars. So longitude is always a trickier thing to determine. And most of the astronomers of the, you know, 1700s, even into the 1800s said, you know, we're going to figure that out based on astronomy. We're going to get some calculations so that we can figure out what our longitude was. Now, thinking about what's where, why is it there, and why should we care? Why do we care about figuring out our position? Well, think of at sea. If you don't know what your longitude and latitude are in tandem, there are lots of hazards out there, shipwrecks being most notable. So after there was a very famous Royal Navy scuttling at the Isles of Scilly, Scilly, off of England. I think it was around 1720-ish. The British government decided to actually put up money to have someone come up with a solution to this because, look, we just lost 100 ships and all these sailors, and we've got to do something. We've got to, because they didn't know where they were longitude-wise. So the nice thing about this story, one of the fascinating things, is that it was a sort of a lowly clockmaker that came up with the solution and figured out how to create a portable clock that could be used at sea that was calibrated to the time at Greenwich at the Royal Observatory, and figured out if we could figure the time difference between this clock here and this clock here, we could figure out our longitude, because every degree of longitude is basically 15 degrees of, across the Earth's surface this way. And so figured out what our position would be based on a clock, as opposed to figuring out based on the stars. So it was one of those triumphs of the common person stories where the people in the establishment said, well, he's not a learned man. Now, how can he figure it out? And if you go to the Royal Observatory in London, there's a couple of Harrison's clocks. The first one was like the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. The second one was half the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. The third one was something you could actually hold in your hand. So as he, each one of these took like 10 or 15 years to build. And as he got smaller and smaller, they got to be portable and actually something you could take on a ship. But there's a couple of models of them in the Royal Observatory. Very cool. And also, I just wanted to read or tell you about a couple of my other favorite books here, and that is The Map That Changed the World, or anything from Simon Winchester. He's very well researched in his books. But The Map That Changed the World is about the kind of touching on what Leslie was talking about, the world's first geologic map. So this guy named William Smith was trudging around building canals in the 1810s, 1820s in England and Wales, and noticed, hey, there's this sequence that I'm noticing in the strata. And then made some very careful observations. And, oh, that sequence is repeating in this part of the country versus that part of the country. And at first, people weren't very impressed by, hey, I've got a geologic map that I'm creating showing a new science called stratigraphy. And I can look at and determine what the layers of the rocks are based on their sequence in these different parts of the country. But then when people realized, hey, we can figure out where all the coal is located if we follow this guy's map. Then, of course, is one of those tales that later in life, he became kind of a famous figure. But for a while, it was that same old story about him being in debtor's prison and wasn't able to pay his bills. And then right before he died, oh, this William Smith really was a hero, because now we can extract minerals. And of course, that was the kind of the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. So that's a fascinating tale of not just technology, but again, kind of about the common person, just having a vision and seeing things in new ways that other people hadn't seen. I love that. I'm rather fond of, my own book here, Interpreting Our World, which is all about geography being revolutionary. That's one of my books. And I'm rather fond of that because I talk about Pliny the Elder and about the Al-Idrisi silver map and some of the other things I've mentioned here, but also about new mapping technologies as well. So it kind of spans around 3,000 years of history, maybe even more, because I go back to the Babylonians. So, okay, 6,000 years of history. But I like that one. Hope you do too. But there's other good books in here that I think are fascinating. On a modern geographical kind of social geography note that some of you are just talking about right now more recently, about a year ago I read this Let Them Eat Pancakes book by Craig Carlson. So Craig was a film student at USC in Southern California, maybe it was UCLA. Anyway, and came back from a trip to France while he was a undergrad, and was eating at Denny's, I think it was, in Southern California. It says, that's the only thing I miss about America when I'm over in France. I miss these big American breakfasts. And then he thought, that's it. I'm going to open an American breakfast diner in Paris. And they're like, Craig, you're crazy. You're a film student. You don't know anything about opening your own business. You don't know anything about managing a business. And first of all, it's Paris. Who's going to want to eat pancakes, American pancakes, and drink American coffee over in Paris? He's like, I've got a vision and I'm going to follow it. So he's got 2 or 3 restaurants now. It's one of those tales of, having a vision and following through and not letting French labor laws and all kinds of crazy stuff that he had to encounter, because basically he couldn't fire a person after like 90 days. It was almost impossible to fire anyone over there, even if they did nothing on the job. So all kinds of interesting, cultural differences, really interesting to think about why and how do certain foods affect us, right? It's all geography. Some of the things that you ate when you were a kid, I'd probably say that's kind of disgusting, vice versa, right? And so I love that whole perspective of what do we think is good and what do we not accept. I'm from Colorado. I'm from this big rectangular land lot. Well, it's not really a rectangle, right? We could talk about that. When I'm down in New Orleans, maybe you can relate, and you see people eating crawfish and oysters, and And maybe you're an adventurous person eating wise. I'm a geographer, so I try to embrace all, but there's just certain limits I have to my own food adventure. Let me just say that. I'll let the professionals eat those raw oysters. Thank you very much. That is great. I can observe, and that's fascinating. But anyway, that is a nice touching on, cultural and social geography, which is all part of geography. It's religion, beliefs, music, um, sense of place. That's all part of what geographers studied. So it's not just the landforms and the rivers and the natural hazards of our world. It's actually quite bound in region and perception and so on. So it's great to be working with all of you here. And unfortunately, David McCullough, who I have listed here, some of you may know this. I know you're a very well-read community, the Academy community. He just passed away like 2 months ago. Really a sad day because I love everything that he's written. The Pioneers, his book about the settlement of Ohio, and I'm not even from Ohio, and I thought that was fascinating. 1776, I mean, he spent, a year writing each one of his big tomes. So they're all history and geography. I love everything that he's got written. So yeah, that was a big loss for the community for sure. But, in tribute to him, read one of his books. Any of you have something, that's geographical book-wise to share that's one of your favorites?
Not really, but von Humboldt. He was like one of the most famous people on Earth at the time he was doing his walkarounds and studies, and he's disappeared. But is there a good source to follow him up?
Yeah, The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf. So at our conference, the ESRI conference, I had the opportunity to meet her. And this book of hers, The Invention of Nature, is all about von Humboldt. So let's see, who was just sharing that? Tom?
Yes, sir.
Hey, Tom.
Yes.
Like Tom is saying, von Humboldt was one of those visionaries way ahead of his time. So among many other things, and feel free to add to this, he discovered that the Orinoco in Venezuela, actually, there was a bridge into the Amazon. Like he could get from the Orinoco to the Amazon, and people were like, you're nuts. There's got to be a big mountain range in between there. But he's discovered how to get from one to another. And so did lots of exploration in South America and came up with, basically the first authoritative map of that part of the world. And then, skipping forward, he was one of those polymaths, right? People that knew about botany and geography and cartography and anthropology, etc. Climbed Chimborazo. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but that peak that's basically the farthest from the center of the Earth because it's it's really close to the equator. I mean, more than Mount Everest. When you think about this, if you've got a peak on the equator, it's actually farther from the center than Mount Everest is, because Mount Everest is about 35 degrees north latitude. But climb that, and then fast forward, he was 59 and he decided to go to China from Germany, his homeland. And of course, there were no autobahns then, right? 1850-ish. Got all the way to the Mongolia-China border. Part of it on an elephant. Interesting. But all the way across Siberia, part of Siberia, what's now Ukraine, part of Russia. And the guy's 59 years old. Anyway, but like Tom is saying, when he passed away, there were parades in New York City and elsewhere, and really an amazing, and also on the cultural geography note, seeing how people recognized and starting to recognize science as this is notable. This is a noble profession, and it needs to be taken seriously. And but yeah, so I met Andrea Wolf backstage at the ESRI conference. I felt like a groupie, and it was right before I had to go on the stage. She was giving a fairly big presentation. Mine was like 5 minutes long. But I'm like, Andrea Wolf, I've read your book. Thanks for being here. I felt like, I was around, I don't know, Mick Jagger or somebody. It was like, this rock star but she's wonderful, and I love that book. So thanks for mentioning that. Excellent. Okay,
I have a couple books I like.
Yeah. Okay.
A Geography of Time by Robert Levine, and it's how every culture keeps it just a little different, time a bit differently. And it's called The Temporal Misadventure of a Social Psychologist with Time and Different Places. So I really enjoyed that. And The Revenge of Geography by Robert P. Kaplan. The subtitle is What the Map Tells Us About Coming Conflicts in the Battle Against Fate.
Yep. Kaplan was the president of the American Association of Geographers. Maybe that was David Kaplan. Anyway, yes, I know that book. And then the first one you mentioned, is that the one where the professor goes on sabbatical down to Brazil?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and people show up 2 or 3 hours late for a meeting and it's like, okay, well, that's just the way it is.
Right.
Okay.
No apologies.
Right.
That's the way it is.
Yep. And it's just different. And, on a related note, when I read that book, and I agree, that's a fascinating, and he ranks the countries in terms of their temporal adherence to the clock, right? Isn't that the one where and Switzerland was number one in terms of its adherence to, trains leaving on time, clocks in public squares being accurate. Yep. And on a personal note on that, not long after I read that, I was in Switzerland for work travel, and I did notice that. I mean, I was a couple of times 1 minute late for the train, and here it's like, well, the Amtrak will still be there, but there it was not even visible. It was gone. It was already gone. And another time on one of the trains there, I understood very little of what they were saying because it was all in German, but I understood for the body language what was happening, but there was a young man that had his foot in the door of the train, holding it open for his friend to appear. And this older lady came, with a walker, okay, stood up beside me and went over to him and basically, spoke in German, but, gestured, young man, you need to get your foot out of there because we need to leave. The time, it's time. And he did, respectfully, he actually did. I can't remember whether he went into the train or he left the train. But anyway, the point was it was time to leave, and we're in Switzerland and we need to leave on time. It was just fascinating just to watch the interchange there. But it was bold. I'm like, that's pretty bold of you to do. But hey, I love that book. That's a great one. Thanks for sharing. I have a video on my Our Earth channel about the I do this every year. At the end of the year, my favorite books from this year. And, nowadays, as you folks know, it is so wonderful to have Hoopla and Axis 360 and other things that you can get through your public library. That's just absolutely one. Audiobooks. I still like print books, just like I like printed maps versus digital maps, but the audiobooks are really nice. And sometimes they're narrated by the authors or someone that they hire to be really good. So in high school, for example, one of the key readings, but somehow I got through high school without ever reading this, but The Count of Monte Cristo. I mean, that's all about history and geography for those of you that haven't read it. It was written by Dumas around 1840. Dumas was from France, and the audio version of that was the French accents, the Italian accents, the English accents, and the Spanish accents were all really well done by a single narrator, and he did all the male and the female voices, and it was just absolutely wonderful. It took me about 5 months to get through it. It is a big tome. And I read other books in the middle. Maybe some of you do this too. You've got a couple that you're reading at the same time. But it's a fascinating tale of lots of interesting themes, revenge, forgiveness, and then what life was like for the different classes of people, socioeconomic classes back in the early 19th century. Really interesting. So that's all history and geography too, but also cultural geography as well. Gosh. Okay, folks, we have done a lot today. We have really grappled with what's where, why is it there, and why should we care in our course. I hope you found it interesting, and I love this discussion at the end. If you think of additional maps or books that you've read that have a geographic or historical theme, I'd love to have another dialogue with you all about that. But I hope this has been helpful. One of the last things I wanted to share, and I'm going to put this in the chat box, but we're going to talk more about this next week. How do I know if a map is any good? How do I know if it's any good? Meaning that, is it authoritative? Who created it? How was it created? Can I trust it? With everybody being a map maker, that's something we're going to get into next week. But as maybe a bit of homework, fun homework, I'm going to put this blog of mine in this. It's called Spatial Reserves, and it's all about three things. Where do I find mapped data? How do I know if it's any good? And then societal issues: copyright, location privacy, ethics, quality of maps, and so on. So I hope you find that useful. And again, take a look at this chat box. There are all the links to, for example, this presentation that we've only gone partly through. We'll go through more of it next week. And as a reminder, right, Marianne, we've got a delayed start next week just because I have a scheduling conflict there. And we're going to start at 1 o'clock Mountain Time next Friday.
That's correct.
It's going to be another mappy time, folks. It truly is. And I don't know if Marianne has the capability of adding people, but if you've got friends that want to sign up for this for next week, you're like, hey, this is going to be really cool and interesting and relevant to our times. Feel free to invite folks.
We would love that. Please call our Academy telephone line and Debbie can help them get registered, or even just to join as a guest.
Cool. Thanks for your support, Marianne. And you all have a mappy day. And I will be with you all next week. Looking forward to it. Thanks for all the discussion and for your interest in this. It's all one thing for Marianne and I to talk about this, by ourselves, but it wouldn't be anything without having you all here. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank
We
you.
will see you
See you
all
next
next
week.
Friday at 1 o'clock instead of the regular start time at 10. At 1 o'clock. Leslie, I know you joined in late. Just take notice that the meeting will be from 1 to 3 next Friday.
Thanks, Marianne.
Let me
Thank you
close with the
all.
song. And more, much more than this, I mapped it my way.
Bravo.
We love it.